All right. Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm very happy to see so many people turning up tonight. And we are in Japan, and this is the Tokyo session of the journey of Mira Midgley's Biscuit Tin. And just very quickly, for those of you who are not up to date, this project is I think it grew out of a wonderful project, the In Parentheses project, which has been started by Claire McCone and Rachel Wiesman. And it deals with 5 fantastic female philosophers from Britain. And one of them was Mary Midgley. And this project sees Midgley's Biscuit Tin travel around the world in 12 locations. And in each location, a philosopher and a poet have a little conversation about some topics that were important for Mary in her philosophical work. And tonight I'm here with Yasuhiro Yotsumoto, Japanese poet in Yokohama at the moment. Am I right?
That's right.
Very good, very good. And my name is Istvan Zardai.
こんばんは。
My name is Istvan Zardai. I'm a philosopher, and I'm talking to all of you from Hamamatsu right now. So we are going to discuss some aspects of Mary Midgley's work. And Mary was a philosopher. She passed away 2 years ago at the age of 99 after a fantastic life. And maybe there are 3 key things I would mention about her. One is her fantastic love for her family. If you read her autobiography, Minerva's Owl, she describes her family very lovingly. And I think that sets the tone for her whole life. The other thing is that she has been one of a generation of very, very talented philosophers who grew up and was trained at Oxford in the 1940s. And she was good friends with Philippa Foot, Mary Warnock, Elizabeth Anscombe, and Iris Murdoch. They were at Oxford at the same time. And what the In Parentheses project, our parent project, is trying to show is that there are several interesting and exciting connections between their work that go beyond just chance. And so the third thing I would want to mention about her is that her work addresses many issues which are of interest to people beyond philosophy. And she engaged very prominently with protecting and caring for the environment. And I think this is profoundly important, one of the profoundly important messages of her work overall. So I recommend you all to, for those who haven't yet read her works, to engage with them. And so we're going to first, Yasuhiro and I, we're going to have a little discussion about some core topics in Mary's work. And after that, we will open up the floor and people will be able to ask some questions. And we will also have the chance to listen to 2 of Yasuhiro's poems. So with that, I would actually, I think it's time to get into it. So the first topic we are going to talk a little bit about is Mary's conception of philosophy and poetry. And she had a very interesting metaphor about philosophy's role for society, saying that it's, she compared it to plumbing. And the idea, I think, as far as I understand it, is that plumbing is essential for our lives. We need clean water and we need good plumbing for everything to work well. But we don't notice this fundamental underlying structure of our everyday, and we only notice it when it goes wrong. Which is that philosophy is similar in that it can keep our conceptual, the underlying conceptual structures of our life healthy. It can sort out problems with these. But people don't notice the need for philosophy when the conceptual problems that create real problems in our lives are not apparent. And there is an interesting connection she points out with poetry. And I was wondering if, Yasuhiro, you could say some things about what you thought about what Mary said here about poetry.
Well, actually, I had never met any philosopher in my life until I met you a couple of summer ago in Yokohama, and and of course I never heard about Mary Midgley until then, and it was such a fresh surprise to find how actual her writing was when I, eventually started to read her writings. I thought all philosophers are very conceptual and with a messy hair, but her writing is very actual, dealing with the real stuff. And she seems to hate a dogmatic approach to any matter, that she embraces pluralism, and I found it very similar to poetry. The poetry is the language of and as opposed to or. It tries to combine two different things, light and darkness, or life and death. It does, whereas a logical language tries to dissect it, and but her it's interesting that her way of using the language is very logical. It's like a divorce lawyer who mercilessly attacks the other side of a marriage couple. But what she's fighting for is this poetic view of the world, of this pluralism. So it's a very unique combination to me, that I found a poet in a very prose, a logical way of thinking. So to me, she is a prose poet.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I really like that you mentioned the lawyers, because that's one of the things Mary also mentions, that besides being a little bit like a plumber, philosophers are also like lawyers, and they can overdo it. They can get lost in technical arguments and debates, but they can also be a little bit maybe like a law maker, right? They can also systematize sensible ideas in this logical way that you mentioned. So this kind of interesting duality is there. And I
Right.
think she says at some point that the really great philosophers, like maybe Plato, Aristotle, they have this kind of combined these poetic, but also lawyer-like qualities in their work.
Yeah, she can
And
be a defense lawyer for poets.
that would be maybe useful. And so based on these ideas, we started talking about poetry and the role of poetry. And I remember at the beginning, I had a very instrumental idea about poetry, and I think this was a fantastic opportunity for me to rethink this quite simple stance that I had. And in some ways, you seem to have grasped Midgley's idea. I now think a little bit better. Like, would you tell a little bit about what your vision of poetry is?
Well, I want to quote Gary Snyder's short poem, which says, "It comes blundering over the boulders at night. It stays frightened outside the range of my campfire. I go to meet it at the edge of the light." So to me, poetry is something like a badger. It's very sensitive. It hides in the darkness, and you got to be very patient and careful to meet it. In fact, I don't think I have ever seen it, but having been writing poetry for, almost 4 decades. I think I have sensed it getting fairly close to the range of the light.
That's a very, very interesting vision. And so I think it leads this is a nice place where we can connect maybe our next main talking point, beastliness. Because you mentioned that there's something interesting about poetry which you liken to a badger, right? And so one of Mary's main interests was human nature, but humans as animals and our animal nature and the nature of animals. So she wrote a book titled Beast and Man, and Yasuhiro and I read this book, and the main idea I think of that book is that throughout history, humans have very often played an unfair trick on animals. Namely, they took all their own negative properties and qualities and projected this onto animals. And they created this notion of the beastly, the beast. And um, Midgley in the book shows very convincingly that there are many, many, many references in philosophy, historical works to all kinds of animals as beasts and all kinds of attributes like being evil, being prone to excess. These are attributed to them, being malicious, um, cruel. And what Midgley tries to show is that actually people um, tried to get rid of their own bad sides in this cheeky way through this trick. And what did you think about the book, or what were mainly maybe some ideas that you that resonated with you?
First of all, when you first contacted me, which is almost 2 years ago, I think, you wrote that we could pick up some main topic, and one of them was instinct,
Yeah.
and we agreed to deal with that. But at that time, being Japanese and not a native English speaker, I somehow confused instinct with intuition. And all along, for the first several months, I was thinking that we are going to talk about intuition, which to me is the central part of writing a poem. And when I realized that we are actually indeed talking about instinct, and it's this book about beast and a man, I felt really a bit panicked. I thought, what am I going to talk about instinct? I am interested in intuition, but I have no idea what instinct is. But as I went along, I found the book fascinating. And first of all, she made such an effort and the strategic discussion to really convince this fact that man is an animal. We are part of the whole animal world, which to me is such a matter of course that Japan, as you know, Istvan is a country of animism, and we see little goals in every little animals. You go to shrine everywhere, and there is always fox and little snake there. And there is also this Buddhism influence in our culture. So people naturally talk about reincarnation, that you must be a monkey in your former life. And my zodiac is a wild boar. And the people like a certain temper of me to, there you go, you the pig mentality, etc., etc. So the that her point itself is not a surprise to me at all, but the way she tries to convince her colleagues into that conclusion is eye-opening. That I thought I have seen the way philosopher argues for the first time. It's so systematic, so strategic. It's a joy. So even though I just said it's a contradiction, even though I said that being a part of the animal is no surprise to me, still after reading her book, I was really eye-opening and wow, I am animal. She really convinced me.
Yeah, I really like your what you say, that maybe the idea wasn't so revolutionary. I think many of us who have read Aristotle, or who have a more naturalistic mindset these days, also in Europe or in the US, um, treat this as a pretty self-evident idea that we are animals. But I liked, for example, very much that the way she argued was she made use of a lot of recent results in ecology, in anthropology, and she was working with science and to show, to make sense of this in a very humane way. And one of the points that was very, very interesting for me was that she emphasized that often actually animals have more regulated lives and more rule following lives, lives that follow fixed patterns than humans do. And she had this interesting discussion there about instincts, right? Open instincts and closed instincts. And one of the
Yeah,
things that she mentions is that our open instincts, in the case of humans, they're very, very open, and they enable us to alter and change our behavior in so many different ways. I found that a very fascinating discussion, and maybe one where it really shows that it is worthwhile for philosophers to have a vision, um, and to engage science, but not just blindly to follow what people in ethology or people in anthropology say. Um, and this kind of vision creating quality of the book is, I think, remarkable as well. I very much enjoyed this. Besides, I'm
mm.
a big lover of animals, so
Oh,
of course.
I also like her discussion about closed versus open instinct. So to make a circle complete from this intuition to instinct. By the time I finished reading that book, I was really asking myself, is poetry or writing poems a instinct for us humans? Is it a closed instinct or open instinct? What do you think, Istvan?
Well, at first I was very baffled by this. But then you recommended me that wonderful book about language and magic.
That's right. Izutsu
Izutsu,
Toshihiko.
Toshiko
Mm,
Izutsu.
mm,
And it's a delightful book, and I didn't know what to expect. I mean, it's mainly anthropology and sociology, but he makes a very interesting case, right? That many of our first instances as human beings historically were probably about magic, and we tried to bring about all kinds of outcomes by ritualizing language and
right.
engaging in language use. And
Yeah,
and there he argues in the book that a lot of our current language use patterns are just
that's
leftovers.
right.
We're
Yes,
still
yes.
using language in all these interesting ways
Yeah.
to influence others. And now it works because it
Mm,
became convention or tradition, but it didn't
mm,
necessarily work at the beginning, where it was a bit more like magic. It's very
mm,
interesting. And I found that, yes, this in this sense, our languages and maybe poetry as well has an instinctive quality that we try to affect things around us as agents.
right.
And as
Yeah.
long as we don't have a very naturalistic or science influenced world of the view, we might think that we influence a lot more than what most people think maybe they influence today through their actions. And maybe these exercises of agency that we try to alter our environment to fit us, that's definitely something instinctual, I think. So yeah, we get back to this. Yeah. And I think this
I
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I agree with you, and I think definitely this poetic imagination is so deeply rooted in our intelligence, in our consciousness, that I like to call it an instinct that any human, if not writing actual poems, but the enjoying this poetic imagination, almost a closed instinct. But at the same time, coming back to this beastliness and we, an animal, I think we are very unique compared with all the other animals in that we use this symbolic language, or we use language in such a symbolic way as opposed to more direct or a language of designation, simply pinpointing this is a banana. Well, our language is almost cursed with association and the imagination, and it goes out of control of rationality. And that may be quite a distinct difference between a human and the rest of the animals.
Yeah, and this brings us to our third topic that we wanted to address, right? Irrationality. And you said this was also something that you were very interested in these days. And I was looking at Mary's book, Science and Poetry, and she writes there about this interesting relationship between science and poetry, and she's suggesting ways in which these can be seen as two approaches to how we can see the world, but they complement each other. They don't fight each other. And she writes something that I found very interesting about the Romantics. She writes that what Blake objected to was single vision, the inability to look at things from any angle other than the scientific one. It was not Newton's discoveries themselves. All the great romantics made this effort to bring both sides together, which is just what makes them great. And I found this very interesting that she emphasizes that there is this irrationality and the role of the imagination here, but that can actually help us to see more. It's not something that science should replace. And I was wondering, so when we started talking, you mentioned that you think irrationality has a big part in writing poetry as well.
Yeah, well, we've been kind of talking about it all along this evening, but the logical language, such as Mary's so skillfully used to convince her opponents, dissects this chaotic world and lay out each piece in the logical order, along with a time sequence. That's the ordinary language. That's the logical language. And I think the poetic language goes the other way. It tries to break up that linear sequence and conjure up all the pieces back into the whole. And this is where this magical element of the language comes in. The language is basically a very rational being. It has the meaning, it has the logic, it has the grammar, but somewhere along with these rational and logical element or aspects, there is this magical power which brings back and reinvent the wholeness, which as soon as we utter this logical language is broken into all the pieces, but it somehow brings it back. And that's to me, the opposite direction of rationality. And the poet somehow tries to manipulate that. And and this is what Mary talks about when she praises the ethologist's approach of not put everything in one argument or in one theory, but rather see each pieces and try to put it in their own respective context and see certain connection in between them. It brings the pieces together, and that's what a poet does. See a feather and a stone, and somehow it brings them together to see a very fresh, new beginning of.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that there's this connects us nicely to the last topic that we wanted to very briefly address, namely how this all relates in Mary's view to science and a scientific understanding of the world. And I think it's very interesting in the both in the Beastliness book and in the science and poetry book that she emphasizes several times that, of course, nobody should have any problem with all the discoveries and all the understanding that science has provided us with. It's more just an issue of extending some methods which were successful in science, for example, in physics, which individualize every phenomena and break it down into smaller, more simple, easier to understand or better observable phenomena. And that's how we learn more and more and more. And she notes that sometimes these days, people, even in philosophy, seem to think that this is the best way to get to know what humanity is, what our moral problems are, what our political problems are, and how we should solve these. And of course, it might work for some problems. There's nothing wrong with looking at economic data and analyzing carefully every situation. But in the end, we need some kind of vision and we need some kind of motivation and values along which to organize society, and that can help us move on or solve our problems and structure our life in ways that are beneficial for human beings. And that calls for this unified whole view. I think that's a very interesting takeaway in her book. Um, and I found it very rewarding to read it in a way that she touched it in a very accessible way, supported by a lot of examples. So I think this brings us roughly to the end of the time that we allocated to ourselves to sort of introduce these topics and some of Mary's ideas, some of our own ideas about them. And before we open up the floor to the audience to ask questions or to share their ideas with us, I would ask Yasuhiro to read out one of his poems. And you wrote these poems while and after reading Mary, right?
Actually, literally, I go to a riverside in Munich where I used to live up until March this year. And I read almost every afternoon Mary's big book, but in between I wrote some poems, and this is one of them. So I read. 聖ルカの牛。牛の息で耳が濡れている。長い舌は世界について語っている。牛が寡黙に草をはみ、人が名付けるのに忙しいこの世界について。手はその一語一句を素早く書き写す。何一つわからぬままに。言葉はどこからやってくるのだろう。と問いかけるのも言葉。星はただ瞬くだけ。心は刻々体から溢れてゆく。意味の重力に抗って、生きとし生けるものの無言化に誘われて、牛の舌と人の耳のわずかな隙間に、名付けられないが隠れている。声を立てずに笑っている。
Right, thank you so much. It was fantastic to hear it in the original. And just for the benefit of those of us who who are not fluent in literary Japanese, I'll read out the English translation. And so the title is St. Luke's Cow. Ears wet with the cow's breath. Its long tongue talking about the world. This world where cows eat grasses in silence and men are busy naming things. His hands swiftly jot down every one of those words, though hardly understanding a thing. Where do these words come from? It is also words that ask such a question. Stars just twinkle without words. Moment by moment, hearts flow out of the body, breaking away from the gravity of meaning, tempted by the wordless songs of all the living creatures. In a tiny space between the cow's tongue and the man's ear hides the unnameable, laughing soundlessly. Right. Definitely food for thought. And I love this poem, and we chose it in discussion partly because I think it illustrates your Ars Poetica very well, and also some of the ideas by Mary. So we have now about 20, 25 minutes left, and I would like to invite the audience to contribute if they have been inspired to any ideas, if they have any questions or any insights that they want to share with us. Just keep in mind that the recording will continue, so you will be recorded, and your contribution will be later shared on the notes from a Biscuit Tin side if you speak up. And you can type your questions maybe perhaps in the chat first, and then Claire will act as chair, and she will call on people to make their contributions and speak up.
Thanks a million. I was really by your words, Yasuhiro. That poem was really moving. Thank you very much. Okay, everyone. So if you have questions or you have comments, or you just like to express your appreciation for the poem, you could type something in the chat and I can just call on people. Or yeah, because I think that's probably the best way to do it. Yeah.
Is there anything already there that we should...
maybe no, there's no one there, but perhaps they will type things now. I mean, I might something really struck me that you said at one point, Yasuhiro. You said that you knew that you were an animal before you read Mary's work. You know, Japan is very sort of animism is very much woven into the culture. But you said that somehow after you read the book, it opened your eyes and you thought, wow, I'm an animal. And I think like I've had that phenomenology as well. that thought in a different context where, of course I know I'm an animal, of course I know that, but sometimes it's really brought home to you that really you are. Yes, you are.
Mm. Mm.
And yeah, I mean, and I just think in some ways there's lots of things that we know, but that we don't, that are not rounded beliefs in us. They're not really deeply held, or they're not. So that kind of, that experience you had where you had, you know, wow, I am an animal. I think like that's almost like the holy grail. Like how do we make beliefs that we already have real in that way, kind of really
Mm.
active in that way?
Mm.
And I know, yeah, well, I mean, I just wanted to say how struck I was by that.
Yeah,
And I wonder if poetry can help with that somehow.
to me, it's the benefit of having a totally new channel of thinking. To me, you know, I knew that I was an animal, but in a certain way, in a quite intuitive way, I think. But Mary led me through this very clear and illustrative the process of demonstrating how and why I am an animal. And so even though the conclusion is the same, the path to get there is a completely different channel. Maybe this is my first exposure to philosophical the approach of the matter, but that's a new experience and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting because I think mine was the other way around. I think I really believed it, but
Yeah,
I didn't
maybe.
like.
I bet.
Yeah, yeah. I have a question. Uh, Ian, can you put your, yeah, Ian is ready with the question. Can you ask your question,
Oh.
Ian, James Kidd?
Hi,
Can
everyone.
he?
Can you hear me, Claire?
I
Yeah,
can.
very
Can everyone hear Ian? Yeah.
Hmm?
Morning, everyone. A question for Yasuhiro. I'm thinking of the wonderful Japanese Buddhist poet Issa. Many of
Mm.
his verses, of course,
Mm.
feature animals, and I'd like to hear a little more from you about how Buddhist poetries could be ways of cultivating our imagination, our empathy, and our sensitivity to animals.
Mm. Mm. Yes, Issa's one of the most famous Issa poem, in his case, this is haiku, is やれ打つな、ハエが手をする、足をする。Maybe Shoko-san, you can translate it, but it simply says, don't hit that fly. It's doing this gesture, begging you to spare his life. And I read a very similar poem written by William Blake that he was about to hit a fly to death, and then he realized that, oh, this fly is me. I am a fly enjoying this moment of life. And maybe someday some hand would hit me to nothingness. And I was so surprised that the sensitivity towards a little animal is so similar between Issa, who lived in 18th century Japan, and William Blake in the UK. So yeah, there is this Buddhism and Zen element in the Issa's part, but I think it goes beyond that Buddhism element. It's quite universal and very deep in our minds. Because when you say about this animal element in Japanese poems, the first poem that came to my mind is actually older than Issa. It's a Heian era, so 10th century, something like that. A woman poet by the name of Izumi Shikibu, saying that I want to see you so much, but I can't see you. And she's talking to the lover, and flying on a little river, and she says, "That's me. That's my soul coming out of me." So this interchangeability between you as a human and animal through some invisible thing that we call soul. And in Japanese, it's tama or tamashi. And the tamashi has a particular verb in the Japanese old poetry that it says akugaru. It's literally use your limbs, the hands and legs to crawl out of your body so that it reaches a certain eternity, free from your dying body. And that came to me. Sorry, and I'm not really talking about Buddhism poem, but those are the thoughts that came to me upon your question.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a question from Shez in the audience there. So I don't know if Shez is there. Shez is unmuted. That's great.
Ask.
Oh,
yeah, thank
okay.
I always struggle on Zoom.
Sheridan, sorry.
Okay.
This,
thanks.
I should say, actually, Sheridan is Mary's grandson, so we're really lucky to have him here. So.
Oh, well, it's great to have you guys doing this. And yeah, always great to hear my grandmother being discussed from the other side of the world. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's a really great discussion. I really liked it. I just your observation of Mary as a lawyer defending poetry, I thought that was a really interesting way of kind of way of framing it. I was just wondering if you wanted to expand any more on that thought and what might be at stake, what she's kind of, yeah, how important it is to defend that. So thank you.
You know what? Yes. Well, in terms of the contents, she's really on our side, the poet's side. But the way she elaborated on that, and especially the way she attacks against some of her enemies was really fierce. So fierce that sometimes it was annoying. I was, reading her books in this really peaceful atmosphere on the riverside, and but her fury and her fierce attack penetrates the pages and come to me. And that was the time when I saw this movie called Marriage Story, Scarlett Johansson and Adam someone was there. Have you seen it? The movie, it's about the divorce battle. And Lola Dunn plays the divorce lawyer on the side of Johalet's, the Scarlett Johansson. And she was so tough and so fierce. And somehow in my mind, Mary on this side and Lola Dunn's defense lawyer connects just a silly talk, but that's the most in a serious way that I sometimes dream that the poetry or the poetic imagination should be really placed at the center of our society and policy making. When I think of the environmental issue or the recent rise of neo-fascism politicians, or the widening gap between have and have not, but we need somebody like Mary to really combine this poetic imagination, the actual world, because the poets, after all, are poets, and they have really no direct influence on the day-to-day reality, at least for the short term. So I wish that the people will carry on her spirits and her approach, and I think UK should be very proud of having utilized her insights and thinking in the public policy making in the past, actually doing it. I don't think that has ever happened in Japan, and I really admire that.
Thanks so much, Yasuhiro. So we have a question for maybe Istvan, you might answer it, from Anna Barandella. Anna.
Yes, unmute, sorry. Hello, yes, so I was interested in actually in Yasuhiro's characterization of poetry as looking for connections, looking for ands, for conjunctions of things. And I find that very intriguing, but I can't quite put my finger on what exactly you mean. And I wonder whether you could say something more about it, perhaps in contrast with the kinds of things that, say, philosophy and science do. So philosophy, you might think, looks for logical or conceptual connections between things. Science looks for causal connections between things. Looked at it that way, what kinds of things, what kinds of connections is it that poetry looks for? Thank you.
Yeah, well, Anna, I have to answer that as a poet. So it's not really logical, and but you see, my father died this September, and I was so lucky that I came back to Japan in spring, and really stay here for the first time in 30 years. But because of this pandemic, I was not allowed to be with him all the time, only half an hour per day. And I travel to where he lives. And that's how I spent the whole summer. And when I heard that he has a terminal cancer earlier in the spring, he died in me. That I couldn't help seeing him in the hospital without thinking that, oh, this man is going to die. I mean, there's no way. But he was there, and I lived this summer with sometimes away from him, half an hour in some days with him, and always seeing him both as a dead man and a very, very live person right in front of me. And this is end that I'm talking about. In the material world, you have to be either alive or dead. And being dead is a bad thing, that we have to do anything in order to live. But in the dimension of poetic imagination, it does not go into that binary opposition. It's there, like this Schrodinger's cat in a box in the quantum theory, that we talk about science, and the classic Newton science goes into that binary categorization. But the quantum physics now says that the things overlaps, the possibility or the probabilities always overlap, and it's a matter of chance which side of the probability turns out. And even if this side shows up, there is always the other side. To me, that is the poetic reality. That is what we would like to carry. And coming back to my father, he passed away in September, and I could not, still can't shake this feeling off that he's still there. and he is there. So, before this summer, to me, it's life or death. But now it's life and death as a son, but as a poet, I think I have known it all along by writing poem.
So what kind of, I mean, that really resonates, but I struggle, can I push you a little? So I struggle, and maybe I shouldn't struggle, maybe I should just be content with ignorance or just with a kind of sense of mystery, but let me see. So I just want to know what kind of plane that operates on. Because I mean, one might want to be tempted to say, oh, it's an emotional plane, poetry, vis-a-vis the causal or the logical or philosophy of science. But it seems to me that that doesn't do justice, that there's more than that. It's not just sheer emotions. There's a lot more going on. I mean, should we even perhaps try to kind of delineate what that spectrum is, or should we just embrace the mystery?
Well, you say delineate, and I always think that language of poetry is circular, whereas the logical language is linear. It delineate, it makes a circle, and I'm convinced that it's not imagination. It is the true state of this world. We tends to deviate into rationality, and thinks that things are black and white, and only something that you can touch exists. But I think that is just rather the emotional approach. That's the fantasy. The reality is the other way.
Yeah, that's
Thank
really
you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's incredible. Yeah, Anna and I were talking a few weeks ago about there's a philosopher called Cora Diamond who has a paper called The Difficulty of Reality, and I think it connects a little bit with what you're saying. We have some interesting questions. Thank you. So Daryl would like to make a comment.
Hi, can you see me? I had a problem with my computer, but is it okay now? Can you see me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay as well? Okay. Yes. Well, Mary was my tutor at university for 3 years, and we kind of got to know each other a little bit. She was always very warm and just a wonderful, wonderful person. If you had any problems, you always went to Mary. Mary was great. And just something somebody said before, which was about this bringing together of opening things up and wanting to bring things together. She was the only, this is in the 70s, she was the only woman philosopher in the philosophy department at Newcastle. And also the rest of the department were very much sort of Wittgensteinian, that strain of Wittgensteinian thought, which is sort of, we can solve problems through language. And Mary stood against that, and she wanted to open things up. She wanted to, let's bring in everything. And one of the things she did, which was great, was she spoke a lot about continental philosophy. She always brought Sartre and Beauvoir and Camus. She always brought things into her lectures, into her talks. And this was great for us because, it opened philosophy up. And this thing also about, science, religion, everything can come into philosophy, and philosophy can come into everything. So there's this kind of unity to the world. So she really stood out in the department as the person who wanted to break through, didn't want to close things, didn't want to classify or categorize things. She wanted the human aspect of philosophy. And as young students, we were very, very enthusiastic about that. And very much, I remember having a discussion with a fellow student about the way you said that in Beasts, I think in Beasts and Man, as someone just said, that she gives all these, as Istvan was saying, she gives to all the negative aspects of man to beasts. So I remember speaking, saying, well, you know, how in Feuerbach's book in the 19th century, Essence of Christianity, he says all the good things about man have been given to God. And you know, what Mary was doing was trying to recapture all this stuff and saying, and seeing man as a much greater and wider and more beautiful thing than any of these things can be described. So I just wanted to make that comment, throw that spanner in the works, so to speak.
Istvan, do you want to respond or say something, or does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, very
Based
much.
on your reading?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think Daryl points out some really important things in Mary's work, and I really love that bit about the beauty of humans. That you know, there is something about humanity that isn't captured if you only look at it from psychology, if you only look at it from medicine, if you only look at it from I don't know, economics. And we need that kind of complicated, uneasy unity where things won't line up in one neat picture where we'll have the boxes. Oh, okay, so this is how the medicine box connects with the physics box and that connects with the ethics box. That's, I think, not Mary's picture. Her picture is that there's no such there are no such boxes. But with all that complexity, we have to be a lot more open-minded and just sort through it again. And what we'll end up with is going to be this much more fascinating, much more vulnerable being, but also a lot more potential. And I think that connects to the previous question nicely, because her goals, how she defines what philosophy and poetry can do, there is this capacity to go beyond pointing out connections. To point out connections, you need to make the divisions, you need to have the fragmentation. But actually, we want to have like an interesting unified vision that we can aspire to, that can move us forward, that can help us to get out of the deadlocks that we get into. If we think politics is just having a good economy, we're stuck. We're not getting anywhere. And that's what we see in many ways now, right? Like defunding healthcare, defunding schools, it's not working. So we need these more messy views which are willing to engage with all the topics that come in. And it's not going to be simple, but it opens up chances to have a fresh vision. I think that's
messy views are good. And there's we're kind of running out of the time for the discussion, but there's at least two comments that I think we should touch on, or three in fact. So there's Musashi Kazaki. I don't know if you are unmuted, but maybe we could hear from you, please.
Oh yeah, so it's me. Thanks. Yeah, my comment is pretty simple. What Mary is suggesting is quite interesting, but I think there is a group of philosophers before Mary who had a very similar view on poetry. For example, Margaret Cavendish, she argued against Descartes' skepticism by saying science is just one way to have knowledge. Poetry is another way to gain knowledge about the world. The difference between science and poetry is, how to put it, for Cavendish, poetry enhances our ability and sensitivity to our experience. So in that regard, science is different from poetry, but both are ways to, acquire more knowledge about the world. I.A. Richards, famous Cambridge philosopher working on poetry and literature criticism, had a very similar view. So it seems to me in England, at least, this tradition of philosophy who sort of emphasizes a very experience enhancing or experience organizing aspect of poetry. And Mary Midgley belongs to this tradition. Of course, they are working independently. So I found this quite fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Istvan. Do you or Yasuhiro, do you have anything to add there? Or?
I find this very creative, and I'm a bit. I would have to look at the Cavendish account in more detail, like what she means by enhancing. So I think that can be understood in different ways, right? Like learning more about the kind of things that science deals with anyway, or is this enhancing in a way that it complements or makes it more multifaceted, it gives more aspects to it, more well-rounded. So I think depending on which way of enhancement Cavendish has in mind, this might fit Mary's view nicely as well. But yeah, certainly, I think there are people in the history of philosophy, and definitely in Britain, thinkers, not just philosophers who are taught in academic philosophy courses, but other thinkers who would belong to such a tradition.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That means, well, we have more work to do. Great.
Great. David Musgrave, if you're there, it'd be lovely to hear from you.
Hi, I am here.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just interested because I'm doing my homework for the Sydney leg of the Biscuit Tin peregrination, and I had been reading Mary's book on science and poetry, and I was interested to see that it was more about the focus was more on science, less on poetry, which is understandable, but what poetry was mentioned was from an English and an Anglo-Saxon tradition, which is very much, for a long time, been concerned with rationality, with coherence, and even when it's concerned with irrationality, it does so in a very coherent and logical way. Whereas many other poetic traditions on the planet are quite different, and they seem to represent a different idea of poetry, perhaps to what Mary was referring to. And I was just wondering to what extent Mary was aware of the English tradition being quite specific, and other traditions and other movements in other languages, such as surrealism or symbolism, or the radical indirectness of Tang and Song dynasty Chinese poetry, whether they in themselves, relative to the English tradition, offer up quite radical alternatives.
Great question. If also Ian Kidd might want to come in on this. You might have some thoughts, Ian. I should say, by the way, I didn't realize David Musgrave is our Tokyo Biscuit Tin, or our Sydney Biscuit Tin poet.
The next station.
Yeah, next leg.
He's very naughty to bed.
Does Ian, do you want to add something? If not, I have a very quick comment. I think I.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so what I wanted to say is the way is it. I'll just quickly say this, and Ian can add something, or Yasuhiro. So I think the book is very interesting in that sense. Then why Mary draws so heavily on the English Romantics in my reading was because that period, so a lot of very fast industrialization, and suddenly people realized that science that was there before, maybe 200 years ago, the mechanics or the optics, that started to be applied by the business people, the engineers of the age, the government, the local nobility, to enhance production. The factories were built and so on. And so the poets engaged very actively suddenly with, oh my God, science can have this disturbing effect. And they saw that, okay, science transforms work, it transforms money, it transforms power, and it started to have its own ideology. So there were many people who were touting this reformative capacity of science and the idea that it can replace also not, it is not only a way to enhance our technology and production, but also it can provide like a vision that can replace older visions of what human life is, or how society should work, how we should understand humanity, society. And I think she sees in the Romantics, because they are at that very particular historical moment, an interesting potential to engage with this. But I think at the same time, she's definitely a pluralist. So I would also be interested in what other people think about what Mary would say on what we can draw on from other poetic traditions, because I think she would be someone who would say, of course, there are many and we should learn from
it. Sorry, guys, I'm just wondering, because I'm just looking at the time now. Sorry, that was
right.
excellent. We're running over, and I know that there are more questions in the comments, but perhaps we should just continue with your program, what you were thinking, your original schedule with Yasuhiro. What do you think?
I think we only have a short poem left, right, at the end. Yasuhiro, are you okay if we say, if we allocate 8 minutes, then we round it out to 1 hour 15. So we do maybe one more question and then we get to the poem. Is that okay?
Great. That sounds great. Yeah. And just at the end, I'd just like to say, or Rachel would like to say, one of us will say just 1 or 2 words.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
So just, there's quite a few comments. There was, I don't know if Elvira is still there. If she would like to say something.
Yeah, thank you very much. From Munich, hello. I'm not very familiarized with the work of Mary Midgley, but I recently started to read about her due to a famous and wonderful poetess, a female poetess named Daja Maria Kujukaru. And she made a workshop where we try to understand some of the thoughts of Mary. And what I would like to add is the quality of poetry in combination to music, because even if I don't understand something, I really get the idea. For instance, I got what is the tone, what is the rhythm, what is the culture anybody speaks, like you did before, for instance. As you talked about your dead father, I understood perfectly what you meant, because to me, poetry has this quality of being on the one side asemantic, like music, but on the other side, even metaphoric. And the metaphoric idea is what makes it complex. That's why you can't translate something, but only transcreate. And that's what I think is the most interesting in poetry. And that's why it always, during the whole history, to my little understanding, has been there, even in terms of the most, let's say, in the Enlightenment, where we came in Europe, at least, from a tradition of a really poetic, how can I put it, a poetologic referral, which began to disturb afterwards as a subject understanding evolved. But before, it was like how more in the way of rhetorics of building a poem. And now, what is to me the most interesting is that even the complexity of the myth, is it myth? No, the mystic, is something which is genuinely based on a different, on a whole way of speech, understanding something which is dark and what is the opposite? Enlightened. This is only able if you are able to get more of the only logic understanding. And I'm totally aware that logic is something linear and that poetry maybe is something circular. I'm not even convinced. It may be even spiralic or whatever. I don't know, but that's what I thought. And thank you very much. I'm very happy that I didn't bought some presents for my family. They will be very disappointed about that. So I got a very big present of you. Thank you very much.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I think it's been a present for all of us. And yeah, this last idea about the shape of these things, whether they're linear or spiralic, or I think that's something I need to think about too. Istvan, do you want to take over now?
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments and questions. And I'm sorry I've missed some people off.
Thank you so much to everyone. And thank you, Claire, for chairing. Thank you, Rachel, for helping us set up. And most of all, of course, thanks to Mary, who with her wonderful work inspired us and enabled this. And actually, what we would like to do as a little closing act would be reading out one more poem. And if I am correct, Yasuhiro, you wrote this to Mary.
Yes. 哲学と詩、メアリー・ミジリーに、哲学が終わったところから詩は始まる。と言ったのは、アウシュビッツを生き延びた詩人。確かにそういうこともあるだろう。だが、哲学の手前で立ち止まっている詩もあれば、詩の絶えた後の世界を創造する哲学だってあるかもしれない。缶入りビスケットを愛した人の哲学は、詩と共に午後を過ごす。観念よりも一人の生きた人間にお茶を入れてもらって。窓の外では鳥が飛び立つたびに、木の梢と空の深みの境目が溶けて混じり合う。日が暮れると詩は帰ってゆく。言葉の井戸の底で死者たちの声を聞くために。哲学はビスケットの缶をしまって私たちの方に向き直り、生きるための知恵について語り始める。
And so the English reads, Philosophy and Poetry to Mary Midgley. Poetry starts where philosophy ends, said a poet who survived Auschwitz. It could be so, but there's also poetry that stops in front of philosophy, or philosophy that imagines the world after poetry disappears. Philosophy of someone who loved the biscuit in a tin spends the long afternoon with poetry. A living human being, not abstract idea, serving tea for them. Outside the window, as the birds fly up, the boundary between the trees' twigs and the depth of the sky melting into each other. When the sun is down, poetry goes back to its house at the bottom of the well of words and listens to the voices of the dead. Philosophy puts her biscuit tin away, turns to face us, and starts talking about the wisdom for living.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
So thank you everyone for joining us, and I'll show you the biscuit tin again. It already has many poems in it, and I'll print out Yasuhiro's poems and put them in an envelope, and then they will be off to Sydney soon.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. And I'd just like to say a word on behalf of, in parenthesis, thank you so much to Istvan and Yasuhiro for joining in on this lark and for contributing in such a wonderful way. I think we've all benefited a lot, and I look forward to reading. I know there's an actual cycle of poems that have come out of your collaboration, which I'm really interested in looking at. I just wanted to let everyone here know that there's a poetry competition for children, which is associated with this project. It's called the Young Poets Poetry Competition. It's a global competition open to children. The link is now in the chat. It would be brilliant if you could spread the word among your contacts, because we really want to try and get it out there. There are some worksheets for children associated with it on Mary's philosophy, and they're in English, but yeah, they might be of use to somebody. So do spread the word of that. The other thing that we have is a networking project called Mapping the Quartet. And I'd really encourage everyone that's here, if you could go onto that site and add your details. What the site is doing is trying to create a network of readers interested in the work of Midgley, but also Iris Murdoch, Elizabeth Anscombe and Philippa Foot. And it's not just philosophers, it's poets, it's artists, it's schoolers, it's members of the public, it's anybody with an interest. And we're trying to create this global network. So I'd really encourage you, if you could just go on it today and fill in your details. Lots of us are already there, but it means that we can sort of keep in touch with you and let you know if we've got any further projects that might be of interest, and we can also communicate with each other that way as well. And finally, I'd just really like to thank Rachel Bollen, who is the project manager of Women in Parenthesis, and she has masterminded the whole movement of the Biscuit Tin across the globe. So if she's there, thank you very much, Rachel, from all of us, and have a lovely rest of the evening, everybody, or morning.
Rachel?
I just wanted to say one more thing, actually, which is there's a really lovely PDF of the correspondence between Istvan and Yasuhiro that I have managed to upload onto the website during this discussion. So if you go on to back onto the Notes from the Biscuit Tin website and onto this Tokyo event, it's just next to the Japanese translation of Mary's text. So it's on the right-hand column there. And it contains some of the poems that have been read.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks so much, Rachel, and everybody. So, goodbye.
Thank you all. Have a good night or a good day. Take care.
Thank you. Really enjoyed that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Sayonara.